Biotech, tech bio, and life science investors can seem like a mysterious breed to those who encounter them. Come behind the curtain and learn about the view from their side of the negotiating table. My name's Tom Froggatt, and on the other side of the table, I'm giving you exclusive access to angel investors, VCs, and others who are active in the human health sector as they discuss the fundraising market, how they assess investments, the mistakes they see, and their advice for those heading out to raise money to save the lives of patients. Come and see what it's like on the other side of the table. So I am back with Lazar Bojic of Curie Bio. Lazar, welcome to the other side of the table.
Thanks. Great to be here. I've been on both sides of the table, so it's nice to be on this. Not sure a change, I guess, but
this table should be a much more relaxed one. No, great to see you. And normally we start by talking a little bit about the market, but before we dive into that, I really wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about Curie and about the way that you guys are approaching things, because it's a really interesting model. And yeah, I'd love you to tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, happy to. Basically, if you're a founder of a therapeutics company, or let me take a step back and say, if you have the aspiration to start a company on the basis of an idea you have to make a therapeutic, it's a pretty challenging place to be, because there are a lot of ins and a lot of outs of drug discovery, and you kind of need to know a lot about at least one or two different things, and then a little bit about a bunch of things. So to get access to that kind of help, typically you would go to one of the large venture creation studios, or the incubators, as some people like to call them. And the trouble there is that the therapeutics idea that you have very quickly becomes that venture studio's company. Right. And you end up becoming more like a founder advisor or a very small shareholder in your own idea. You could try to go and raise money on your own and therefore own the lion's share of your own thing. But oftentimes, venture firms don't have large enough teams to give you the help and support that you need for those things where you kind of need to know a little bit about a lot.
Yep.
And so you're kind of stuck in this weird place. And Curie was specifically built to bridge that gap, where founders could retain the lion's share of their own cap tables, but in an economic model where it's also beneficial for us and the to provide them with the help and support that they need to get that therapeutics company off the ground. Now, just taking another step back, talking a little bit about biotech macro. We hear a lot, biotech's expensive, biotech's very capital inefficient, capital intensive rather, and for that reason, that's why these venture creation studios really need to own the majority of these companies, because of that capital intensity.
Yes.
And when you start to ask why, where are all the dollars going, and you peel away some of the layers of the onion, you realize that there are, among many, two major cost drivers, at least from that initial idea to the end of the preclinical phase. And those two major cost drivers are people and space. You need to hire a large enough team, and you need to house those people in a laboratory and office space in order to do the work. And those are the two major cost drivers, which is why you kind of need a bunch of money up front just for table stakes, just to get started.
Yes.
And so wrapping that into Curie and what we do, we decided that we would attack those two major cost drivers in one, building a massive team, and two, getting a large infrastructure in place of contract research organizations globally, so founders don't need to go and build out that lab space. Founders don't need to build out that massive team. The team is us fractionalized. We fill in those gaps of the things you need to know a little bit, but across a big swath of things. And you don't need to build a lab, because we can help you with putting you in front of the right contract research organization, but even more granularly than that, putting you in front of the right team at the right contract research organization.
Yeah, I see.
And by attacking those two major cost drivers, now all of a sudden founders don't have to go and raise a large bolus of capital. They can raise a smaller amount of capital, but make the same amount of progress. So if you can make the same amount of progress on less money, now all of a sudden you become less diluted up front. And because you've made progress, your dilution curve is shallowed out, because now the value of what you've generated by the end of that round of financing, i.e. the seed in our case, will be of high appetite to Series A investors, and therefore you can raise a little bit more money at a higher price, and you can continue to do that. Raise the right amount of money at a higher price to make the right progress against the milestones that will continue to create that value inflection journey that founders crave. And so we have a team of about 75 people so far. Most of my colleagues are drug discovery experts. If you go to Curie.bio and you scroll through the people on our site, you'll notice that the majority of them have made drugs. They have made drugs that have gone into the clinic, and many of them have made drugs that have gone on to become approved products, some of which in biotech households are really household names in terms of drugs. And then we also have a series of support functions that are expressed to founders, all the business operations things like payroll, accounting, IT infrastructure. Basically, founders should focus on the science, not on payroll, right? We have an entire group that focuses on expert network services so that you can get scientific or clinical advisors. There's the group that focuses on external R&D, meaning contract research organizations. What I do, which is fundraising support services. So as these companies make progress against those milestones, I will help them raise their Series A's when they have that value inflecting data in hand.
Yeah, absolutely.
And my recruiting division, which helps our founders recruit folks as they head into the Series A. Once they're going into the A and they're gunning towards clinical activity data during that Series A financing, they're going to need probably a chief medical officer, clinops person, formulation expert. We can help them hire those folks. And a talent group helps us hire internally at Curie as well. But that's basically the model in a nutshell, is expressing to founders help and support and services to get them started, to get them on the path of drug discovery, to making a real drug that's going to look like it's going to go into people, and doing that in an economic model where the founders retain the lion's share of their own thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that equity retention is really important, but also it leaves less for the founder to figure out on their own, right? There's more expertise around them. There's a greater support network so that they can tap into that advice as they need it, rather than, as you said, if you're a founder, you got to work out how to do payroll. You got to go on Google and figure out what that means, right? And that takes time.
And the funny thing is that, there's a common misconception that we hear all the time, which is, oh, Curie's great for academics.
Right.
And while that is true, it's amazing that about a third to a half of our portfolio are actually ex-industry folks. And you would think that those people know how to make drugs, and they do. But like I said before, they know a lot about a few things.
Yes.
And then there's a bunch of stuff that, although they know some things about those things in drug discovery, they could really use the augmentation of those skills. And that's what we do. So it's rare that you can have access to one of the best medicinal chemists in the world, or one of the best cancer biologists in the world, in your war room, so to speak, to help you think through the problems and get around roadblocks. Very rare. And so while, yes, Curie is great for the founder archetype of the academic, Curie is also great for the founder archetype that is tremendously experienced and a seasoned operator in biotech or pharma.
Yeah, and I think even with that experience, they may have more conception of what they need to do and what needs to happen in the business, but do they have more time to do it? No, right? And so it's that leverage idea as well, right?
And it's funny because, like I said, I lead fundraising support services. We call it Investor Network, because what I do at Curie is all things investors, and we can get into that if you'd like. But suffice to say that in talking to very well experienced founders about capital raising, I work with some founders that have raised hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. And when I tell them, I will help you make the deck, I will help you make the memo, I'll help you craft the data room, they're like, wait a second, you would do that for me? Yes, absolutely. And they, like, the seasoned operators recognize leverage on time.
Yes.
I can help them leverage their time. They can focus on the things that are core business objectives while having me run a core business objective, but doing it in a way that is collaborative and leveraging of their time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think, obviously the main focus of our conversation today is on investment. So that's a nice link into that. Um, so we're having this conversation sort of mid-September 2024, Lazar, and there's a lot going on in the world, but from a biotech fundraising point of view, what's your view on the market right now? Where do you think we are?
I mean, I'm always an optimist
Hmm.
in the sense of markets because I always harken back to some of the great investors that always say things like, I think it was Warren Buffett that said, be greedy when others are fearful, be fearful when others are greedy. And when you look at where we are on the XBI today, we're right where we were before COVID mania.
Right.
And by historical standards, that's amazing.
Mm.
And it's really just the panic that was induced by going from the peak of, I think it was somewhere in the 160s, maybe 170s on the XBI, all the way down into the 60s.
Yes.
And even in those 60s levels, we were off the highs pre-COVID of maybe 30%.
Mm.
And a lot of that, I think, was correction or overcorrection
Yes.
of, things that probably, would have had a difficult time anyway being public, let alone on the heels of low interest rate environment. Everybody
Mm.
is gleeful, things are great. So I'm an optimist in the sense that I think we're actually in a great place. I think we're in an
Yeah.
amazing place on the XBI. There's still a little bit of cleanup to do. But when you look at the deals that are getting done, IPOs, when you look at the M&A deals that are getting done, when you look at the licensing deals that are getting done, good deals are happening.
Yes.
And they're happening for the things that they ought to be happening for, which is
Yes.
very good clinical data. I don't know if the viewers or you follow Tim Opler at Stifel, but Tim does a phenomenal job of publishing regular reports. And in
Mm.
September 2023, so like a year ago, almost to the day, I think it was September 24th or something like that, he publishes a report. We're at the trough of the market.
Yeah.
And very good clinical activity from an enterprise value standpoint in the public markets is worth somewhere around, let's call it $700-800 million.
Mm-hmm.
It's like not unreasonable. Like if you have a safe molecule that appears to be efficacious, the market will reward you for that.
Yeah.
And when you look at where we are today, which is substantially off of that trough, now all of a sudden, in Tim's most recent report, that's looking like it's worth maybe $1.2-1.3 billion, which completely
Okay.
comports with the M&A activity that's happening
Yes.
for molecules that have very good clinical activity data.
Mm-hmm.
So where we are in the market today is we're back to, I think, a rational and sensible place where we're making drugs that are meant to be safe, that are meant to be effective, and the market is rewarding those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the challenge, as it always had been, is just getting to that point of generating that clinical data, right? That's always the riskier, choppier bit, but that's, there's a lot of risk there. So that's normal, I think.
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely normal. And remember that once you have that very good clinical activity data, I mean, in accordance with historical industry rates of attrition, you have discharged the discovery risk, the preclinical risk, the safety risk, and the initial efficacy risk. So
Yes.
now then you're sitting in a place where that molecule is more likely than not to get approved, albeit it's still in the 50% probability of technical and regulatory success, but that's a greater than 50% chance.
Yeah.
If you're a pharma company that is trying to fill a void in your pipeline because you have a patent cliff that's 3, 5, 7 years out, that's a perfect acquisition for you in that low 10-figure range because you can make several of those. And now all of a sudden you have 3, 4, 5 that you acquired. One of those is going to be an approved drug, and we know that
Yes.
approved drugs generate fantastic cash flows. And so we're in a totally sensible, totally rational place, in my view, as to where we are today in the market. Good deals get done. Good drugs that are getting made are getting rewarded in those good deals.
Yeah, absolutely. And good companies that are run well and good businesses as well are important too, right? Um, so from the lens of that, our main focus on this show really is helping those who are raising money in the sector really understand how investors look at deals and how they might look at a business differently than a founder might look at it. Obviously, you spend a lot of time having this conversation with people on both sides of the fence. So, you know, for you personally, what do you think are the most important things that founders and leadership teams need to understand about how an investor is going to look at your deal, how they're going to assess your business, your opportunity? What would be the critical things you think they need to know?
Well, let me start with what we look for at Curie, and then
Mm-hmm.
it'll be a good transition into what I think, based on my experiences talking to these folks relatively regularly, what the downstream buyers, namely Series A investors, are going to look for.
Yeah.
We look for three major things. One is, does the science get us excited?
Right.
We literally talk about, does the science give you that like glimmer in your eyes? Like, oh, this is cool. Okay.
Yeah.
That's one major criteria. The second major criteria is, if you were to go and do the relaxing thing that you normally do to clear your mind and think, like going for a stroll in the park, and during that relaxing time, can you connect the dots from that's really cool and exciting science to, if you made that drug, would it be amazing?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I create the backdrop because our minds tend to fill in gaps in interesting and creative ways, especially when we're in those relaxed environments.
Right.
So if you're in that relaxed environment, and in that environment, you can't think of like, what's the path to that drug being amazing, then that would be a very difficult investment
Mm-hmm.
to make, because if you kind of have to like really think about it and say like, would that drug be amazing? Would that be $1 billion sales opportunity? Like, that's going to be a tough road.
Right.
So science gives you the glimmer in your eyes, super exciting. You can connect the dots to an amazing scaled drug if it were to get approved.
Yeah.
And three, team. Like, when people are raising money, they are on their best behavior.
Yes.
I mean, when I was asking my parents for anything, I was always on my best
Yeah.
behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
that's absolutely true of founders and of management teams that are raising capital. And so if you have a situation where those management teams are difficult to work with, or you have that little spidey sense that's like, this might be challenging, that's only going to get worse.
Mm-hmm.
So our third major criteria is team. That's how we evaluate our deals in-house. And
Yes.
of course, there are a bunch of nuances and excruciating details that go into every single one of those elements.
Yeah. Of course.
I don't think that Series A investors examine opportunities all that differently.
Yeah.
I think that they actually maybe flip the order a little bit and say team,
Mm-hmm.
because most venture firms don't have 75 people like we do. And so therefore they take a hands-on approach, but it's just a bandwidth thing. They
Yeah.
can't possibly have those regular weekly, literally daily touch points in some instances. Like when Forward Therapeutics was out there raising, I was texting with the founders daily. We had
Mm.
meetings, routinely update calls. Like, that's totally normal at Curie. That's not necessarily normal at a venture firm when you have a much
No.
smaller team. It's just a bandwidth thing. It's not a criticism. It's literally just a bandwidth thing. So they rely on the team to be able to execute. And that's actually one very common piece of feedback that we get is, what's the team going to look like post A?
Yes.
Which is why at the onset I mentioned we have a full stack recruiting team that helps us hire for our portfolio companies around the founders to round out that executive management team to be able to carry the execution through the Series A. And now things are getting very serious because that Series A is about generating that clinical activity data.
Right.
And so those activities are very serious activities, and you need a management team that can execute on those.
Yeah.
I think that Series A investors take a look at what the market opportunity is, just the same way that we do.
Mm-hmm.
we take it very seriously because we're a seed fund and we recognize that we're going to get diluted over time.
Yeah.
But Series A investors definitely recognize that if you have very good clinical activity at the end of that Series A, that Series B is now going to be maybe $200 million. And so they're going to get diluted. They're going to be able to participate in that B as well, but nevertheless, their A position will get diluted.
Yeah.
And so you have to think about the exit opportunity, which means market, which means pricing power, which means where does it slot in? How does the drug win from a TPP perspective? What's the competitive landscape?
Mm-hmm.
And now instead of examining what we called that glimmer of excitement about the science, now it becomes that, how are you going to clinically develop this thing?
Yes.
I think that's the only real trade, so to speak, between how we evaluate things and how Series A investors evaluate things. And just to close the loop, what that means is an excruciating amount of preparedness that goes into your Series A campaign. I'll just give you an example. It's not good enough to have a clinical development slide that says this drug in this indication, here's the patient population.
Right.
Because there are a litany of questions behind that you need to know how to answer. And maybe in your main deck, you only have that high level summary, but in your data room, I'm really hoping that you have a 5, 6, 7 slide deck that talks about your clinical development plan. What's the phase 1 look like? What's the SAD/MAD look like? How many patients? Why? What's the dosing schedule? When you go into your phase 1B or phase 2A, what's the patient population? Why?
Mm-hmm.
What reason do you have to believe that you're going to topple the incumbent in that clinical activity study? Do you have a new binding pocket? Are you binding on a different side of the molecule? Are you inducing different recruitment elements at the cell membrane, or if it's a transcription factor, are you dissociating or associating different elements of that co-repressor or co-activator complex? Like, all of these things are super important when it comes to, is the drug going to win?
Yes.
And so being prepared to go to talk to investors with all of those ducks lined in a row is extremely critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick up on one thing you said about team, which I think is a really important point that gets overlooked often, because you said the word execution a couple of times. And I think the glamorous parts of being a founder, a startup CEO, whatever, being incredibly creative, having a long-term vision, inspiring people, all that kind of stuff. And that's all really important. But you've got to be able to execute on your plan and deliver it and show, even in an R&D setting where there are a lot of unknowns and timelines will slip and things will happen, you've got to be able to show investors, look, we can deliver. We've got a track record. We've got a proven ability to make this plan happen. And I think that gets overlooked a lot. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
One of my mentors once told me there are two types of people. There are the types of people that they assemble the puzzle until it's about 70% done, and then they see the rest of it complete. And they're like bored. And they're like, I don't really need to finish it. I know how this story plays out.
Right.
And the reality is that the second type of person that's like, I need to finish this because the job's not done until we're at 100%. Of course, there's a dichotomy between those two types of people, because when you get to 70%, the other 30%, that's when you have to do the hard work.
Yes.
That's when the real work starts. And so when I talk about execution, one of the things that we pride ourselves on at Curie is excellence in execution. The job's not done until the job's done.
Mm-hmm.
And the corollary to that is, just like, again, picking on what I do and given the nature of the discussion is around fundraising efforts, I like to remind our founders that you have to be comfortable that your deck is only ever 99% done. Your materials are only ever 99% done. And the reason for that is every time you go out and talk to 5, 6, 7 investors, you have questions, you have feedback, someone sent you a paper, a market report, you heard something in that conversation that they said or didn't say. All those things are a new basis of information.
Mm-hmm.
And after you get 5 to 7 investors deep, you're going to see a pattern from all of those conversations about what's missing in your materials. Update your materials, put them in the data room, send them to the investors that you're about to meet, send them to the investors that you just met.
Yes.
And that's your new 99% deck. And then you have a rate of attrition over your next 5 to 7 meetings, and you do it again. And you got to keep doing that. And you feel like you're on a treadmill, and that's because you are.
Mm-hmm.
If you use the same deck to start your campaign as you do on close to what you think is going to be the end of the campaign, you're either not going to raise, or you're going to raise at a price that is not nearly as good as you could have achieved.
Right.
And so when I say execution, I mean get to that 99% and continue to improve, to strive for that extra 1%, full well knowing that you probably won't get there. And you have to be comfortable in that. You really have to be comfortable in that.
Yeah, and it's, as you say, it's also doing the boring stuff, right? Like, it's not boring for everybody, obviously, and you can bring people in to actually do the parts of it you need to. Maybe not right at the beginning, but as time goes on. But you know, there are a lot of early stage businesses out there that don't have the maturity to do the boring stuff, right? They do the fun stuff.
And it creates a little bit of, creates some cognitive dissonance in truth. Is like you feel like you've just accomplished a task, and so you feel like you should have the right to celebrate. And meanwhile, I just said you have to be constantly striving for that improvement. Yeah. So that creates conflict, right? Those can coexist. Those can absolutely coexist. Like if we take the journey of drug discovery, right? You nailed your development candidate. Take a moment. Yes, great, we achieved that. And enjoy that moment. Recognizing there's more work to be done, but enjoying the moment. And the job's not done because now you need to identify the clinical candidate at the end of your GLP tox studies. And then you need to get to the clinical activity data. Then you need to get through your phase 2 dose ranging study in some cases, in some indications. Then you need to get through your pivotal or pivotals.
Yeah.
Then the drug's approved. The job doesn't end there. Now you got to market that.
Yes.
Now you go through the linear sales ramp. Once you get to the linear sales ramp and you think you're at your peak sales, can you grow it more? And you should celebrate each of those milestones. Those are phenomenal milestones. You're discharging massive swaths of risk. But you should also recognize that it's never over.
No.
Like Nike says, there is no finish line. That's reality. There is no finish line. And that's because once you've reached whatever you thought your peak sales were, and presumably you're a publicly traded company or you've been acquired by a publicly traded company, the next question is how are you going to get 5 to 8% growth next year?
Yeah.
Or how are you going to protect yourself from the competition that's emerging? The job's never done, and that's okay. It's all exciting. Some of it may feel boring, but as long as those tasks that feel boring are contributing to that bigger picture of the ultimate goal, and then the next goal and the next goal, then you should really strive to dig in deep and get the task completed, because it'll make you feel really good.
Yeah. You mentioned sort of the finish line analogy there. There was a quote I heard recently. I forget who it was from. I think it was from Tim Grover. He was Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant's trainer. So he said, people say that it's a marathon, not a sprint. Well, that's not true. It's a sprint with no finish line, which I quite liked.
Tim is an incredible character. I don't know if you know the story of how Tim ended up becoming Michael Jordan's trainer.
Yes.
But he studied he counted the number of steps that Michael was taking during games. That was his inroad. He said, how many steps you're taking to the left, here's how many steps you're taking to the right. You need to counterbalance ball. And like he went through the physiology and he wrote letters to everybody on the team except for Michael Jordan. So he could create this echo chamber around him. It was a pretty impressive story. But yeah, it's a sprint with no finish line.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things you talked about in terms of, I guess, mistakes that you see people making is not quite thinking through the clinical development plan in enough depth for that Series A investor. What are the other things? What are the things that the mistakes that people commonly make when they're going out to raise money that end up either costing them the round or costing them the price they could have got, as you say?
This is a thing that I needed to learn And I finally learned sometime like maybe just after graduate school, maybe during my flagship days. The key to not, and by the way, this connects to the whole boring thing and like doing things that are boring because eventually they become, anyway, I'll get back to that. The key to not sounding rehearsed, because people want to pride themselves when they're giving a pitch that they don't sound rehearsed. And the key to not sounding rehearsed is being rehearsed.
Yes.
It is practicing and practicing and practicing until you know every single line of every single thing that you want to say, which reminds me of two different things. One is there's a collegiate runner named Brock Kelly, and he recently quoted actually Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant in saying, work ethic eliminates fear. Michael Jordan said, if you've put in the work, then you know what you're capable of. So what is there to fear?
Yep.
And that's absolutely true. If you've put in the work to practice and practice and practice, then you know the next line and you can go on autopilot and you can deliver that pitch and you can do it in a way that is not autopilot-y.
Yes.
That's the key. Okay. Number two is adaptation to change and consistency. It's another one of those conflict things. Like consistency is currency. Whatever you're doing, just keep going. Do it over and over and over again. And that is the work ethic element that eliminates fear. Now, some people get too caught up in the consistency, and then when their plan changes, they freak out and they can't adapt. If you've put in the work and you have practiced and practiced and practiced, when someone interrupts you, rudely or not, you can adapt to that because you know what the next line is. You know the next thing you want to say. You know how to acknowledge the question, how to bridge it to the thing you want to say, full well knowing that you might be saying that next. You might be able to stop the conversation, address the question, pause, see if there are any other questions. That's the whole reading the audience thing.
Yes.
And then continuing on your merry way. But that's one of those boring things where you don't want to practice. You don't want to give this pitch for the 100th time. You don't want to record yourself and watch yourself because you feel narcissistic about it. But like the reality is that until you flip the script and see yourself presenting it, you actually don't know what you sound like. You don't want to do all those things. But if you do, it's going to go a tremendously long way because now you're not going to sound rehearsed.
Yes.
And it's quite a remarkable thing. That's one major element that I see founders a little bit reluctant to do. And then when they get through it, they're so happy with their ability to deliver on their pitch, on the Q&A sessions. I always like to help founders get to that place where they've heard an element or they've heard a version of a question in some way, shape, or form so that they can adapt to those changes in real time. So rather than, I'm sorry to be the optimist to turn the negative into the positive of like, what are the mistakes people make? It's like, this is what I help them get ahead of.
Yeah. I understand.
I think and that's kind of what I'm trying to do for the viewers here is like, don't make the mistake of wanting to sound not rehearsed and therefore not practicing.
Yes.
That is a trap.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it can be easy to underemphasize your performance in the room in terms of its importance in the raise, right? Because there's so much work goes up to that point that it all has to be great. But that's game night, isn't it? That's when it matters.
The other mistake that I see people making is this like, nervousness about pinging investors after they've met. Like, and it's such a common question. I'm sure you've heard a million, like, when should I ping them? How soon is too soon? Like, it's almost like a dating thing, right? It's like, oh, should I message them today or should I wait till tomorrow? The reality is that it's totally fine to ping them same day.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed the conversation. Here are the materials that we presented, dropping them here, happy to follow, like something like that. And people are so worried that they quote unquote look desperate. You are raising money.
Yes.
If you don't raise that money, you're going to get very desperate.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no confusion over what the outcome is here, right?
And investors see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of deals. You need to be top of mind for them.
Hmm.
And you're going to be top of mind by best foot forward at all times, presenting well, being a well-oiled team, having an awesome plan, having an awesome story, and then following up.
Mm.
Because it shows your initiative and it shows that you care.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's totally fine to ping them the same day or the day after. If you haven't heard from an investor in 5 or 6, maybe 7 days, after they have told you that they'll reach out, is it okay to ping them? I would say so.
Hmm.
Just following up here, you mentioned that you were going to follow up with your process. Here are some new materials. Remember that whole 99% deck thing,
Yes.
right? You now have some new materials. You freshen up the materials, you send it to them, and you tell them, here's some new material. Like, have a reason to ping them, and don't fall into that trap of, oh, it's too soon. Oh, I don't want to look desperate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a sort of general sales thing as well, isn't it? It's like, everybody's busy, everybody's got a million things going on. We, on the other side of it, on the sort of, in this case, the founder side of it, we read so much into the fact that they've not gotten back to me. That must mean this or that must mean that. Maybe it just means that they deleted the email by accident. Maybe it means that they've been in meetings for 10 hours a day since then. But everything in your head, you make everything personal, right? And that stops people from acting a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, like the one thing I would say is sending emails on Friday goes into ether generally.
Yeah.
Uh, Sending emails during holidays is difficult because if it's at the end of the year holidays, people are trying to wrap up deals. If it's around Thanksgiving, people are trying to figure out where they're putting pens down or pencils down, pencils not down on deals. If you're sending it like last 2 weeks of August, and context matters, if it's last 2 weeks of August and it's a live deal, meaning that you
Mm.
have spoken to that investor 2, 3, 5 times, they'll probably respond. If it's brand new and you're kickstarting a fundraising campaign, you're unlikely to hear from them until after Labor Day.
Yes.
Like there's some nuances there to when to ping, but in terms of cadence, like it's pretty normal to ping investors fairly routinely.
Yeah.
Now, they've said no and they've given you perfectly good rationale, like going, the thing that never works is some scathing thing of like, here's what you missed, and like, you guys don't know what you're talking about, and you don't have the experts. That never works. Like, that's how you end up memeified on Twitter.
Yes, exactly. No, and we've had a lot of investors on this podcast actually say the founders that really impress them are the ones that follow up quickly with the information that they've asked for, and the ones that are really prompt and they're really on it and they're really responsive. That makes a big impression.
Absolutely. And like, to think that you've answered every single question in a live Q&A session perfectly,
Yeah.
a little bit of a fallacy. Maybe you did an excellent job. True. But remember that there's always that little thing that's going to nag at you.
Mm.
And so take the time, if you have 4 or 5 investor pitches, take the time at the end of the day to sit down for an hour with your team and be like, okay, what were all the questions? Who was taking notes? How did we answer that?
Yeah.
And then find the gaps. And in those gaps, you have a reason to ping, right? You haven't heard back in a week. Say, hey, thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I was thinking more about that thing we were talking about. Here's the answer we provided. Here's a few additional nuances, maybe like some materials as well.
Yeah, completely.
Be top of mind, show initiative, show that you care. It's your baby. You're raising
Yeah.
for your thing. You should care
No,
about it.
absolutely. No, I think it's really critical. And then I guess any final nuggets you'd like to leave the audience with, Lazar? Anything else that you think is maybe things that people generally don't think about or that have been really effective from your point of view?
I mean, we've covered most of those things. It's like,
Mm.
you know, the one parting thing is just is plain English works.
Right.
Don't use the synonym just because you want to use thesaurus in Word or PowerPoint. Plain English works. Be descriptive in your titles. The titles are the take-home messages. The content is supportive of the take-home message, which is the title, not the takeaway. That last takeaway box, is, if you insist on having it, is the transition thought to the next slide.
Yes.
Not the take-home message. And be crisp and clear in your delivery, which means the story. People like, there's a pejorative context to what's the story. Like, shouldn't my science speak for itself? No, because there's still a problem out there, fundamentally trying to solve that problem. Why has no one else done that? Meaning, like, why now? Why you?
Yes.
And you have to be able to communicate that. And it doesn't matter if you've just made the world's greatest drug for the world's biggest population of patients in a particular indication. You need to be able to communicate that story. So be crisp, be clear, use frameworks. Don't be afraid of rehearsing and practicing. Don't be afraid of plain English. It's just like the simple, I always get back to basics with these things.
Yeah.
Just like the simple thing works. And by the way, when you're making a deck, don't open PowerPoint first. It's kind of a funny thing, but like if you open up a Word document and you just write out all the things that you want to say, as you say them, not as you write them, as you say them in plain English, and then you take that page or two that you've just written out and you extract the take-home messages. Those take-home messages become the slide titles. And then once you have the slide titles and you read through the slide titles, you should have about a 75% understanding of the story that you're trying to tell.
Yes.
And then the other 25% or so is the content that supports those slide titles. And that is something that I coach founders on all the time, is PowerPoint slides. PowerPoint slides will hide sloppy thinking. It's like the Jeff Bezos. And the reason for that is that you're abstracting from your own thoughts. That becomes incomprehensible. If you go through the thought cycles of writing out the things you want to say, and then you take those thought cycles and you've iterated on those, and then you extract the main points, now all of a sudden you have a story that's communicable to a 75% degree of accuracy. And then you support that with content. Once you've gotten to there, that content generation, that's when you open PowerPoint.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Simple, fundamental basics.
Completely. It's like any presentation, right? You delete more than you say. That's the way to do it, is you get everything out, then delete most of it, get rid of most of it, and leave the core essence of it. Otherwise it's a ramble.
But people do that in PowerPoint, and then next thing you know, you have bullets that make no sense.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point to finish on. Lazar, it's been fantastic to catch up. Really, really helpful conversation. I'm sure people will get a lot out of it, and we thank you very much for your time.
I hope so. And like a plug for Curie, this is one of the many things where we get super deep into the weeds. If this is the kind of thing that you would get as support on fundraising, just imagine what you'd get when it comes to drug discovery, be it an industry professional or an academic.
Yeah, and I've got to say, I'm not sponsored by Curie at all, but I've been really impressed with everyone I've spoken to there, and it's a great mission, and I think a really sorely needed gap that you're trying to fill to really help these companies figure out how they get these drugs to patients.
Indeed. Thanks so much, Tom. Really appreciated this. Really had a blast doing it, and I hope that the viewers get something out of it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us on the other side of the table. I hope you found this episode really useful, and if you did, please hit like and subscribe and share this podcast with someone else that you think will get something from it. And if you want more content from me, you can find me on LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram and Medium. Come and follow along, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.